you know, colleagues joining us today are to a certain extent guinea pigs in the process, because we want to kind of co-produce this and hone it. So there are disadvantages to that, because we will be then, you know, drawing upon your experience possibly more than we would otherwise do. However, the advantage is that you're on the ground floor of something that is new, and I think it's quite an exciting development, because the opportunity to take something which is quite profound and kind of well established, like project management training, but to kind of make it be more relevant to colleagues who work in the third sector, I think is really quite exciting, because there are some challenges, as we know, that we face with, you know, things like European funding if it requires match. I know that may not be something that is such an issue in the future, but I'm sure other funding streams will have their own peculiar challenges, which the third sector in particular, I think, finds difficult. Things like scale of funding as well, it can often be a challenge for the third sector, where resources can be more limited, perhaps. So yeah, I was just explaining a little bit about who I am, and then what I thought would be helpful. And I know we've got about 10 colleagues here joining us this morning. If we could go through very quickly and do a very quick introduction, that would be very helpful for me. So I don't know who best to start with, but if I use my screen and go with the colleague who is top left, I think that's Rachel Wood. If you'd like to just give me a quick introduction, that'd be really helpful, Rachel. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rachel Ward. I'm Head of Marketing and Communications at BCVS, and I've been with the organisation nearly 9 months now.
Brilliant, thanks for that. Julia, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Julie Barnes. I support BCVS in terms of business development and also contract monitoring as well, and some of the aspects of the quality side of our organisation.
Brilliant, Julie. Sorry, I suddenly called you Julia for reasons I don't fully understand, but no, sorry, Julie. Thank you. Kirsty, over to you.
Hi, my name's Kirsty. I lead on the Tackling Loneliness Collaborative, which is hosted by BCVS, but it covers the whole of Nottingham and Nottinghamshire.
Brilliant, thank you. That sounds interesting. Lucy, over to you.
Hello, Voluntary Community and Social Enterprise Development Officer. So anything to do with group development and identifying needs, and to cover Bolsover District and Bassetlaw District.
Brilliant, thanks, Lucy. Andrea, next on my screen.
Morning, Andrea Birch, CEO of Bassetlaw CBS and Bolsover as well.
Thanks, Andrea. Steve, over to you.
Hi, Ian. Steve Morris, Head of Bolsover CBS. I work for the BCVS Group.
Brilliant, thank you, Steve. Marzena, over to you. Sorry, I think you're on mute. Sorry about that.
Good morning. My name is Marzena Singh, and I am Bassetlaw Eastern European and Ethnic Minority Group Development Officer at BCVS.
Brilliant, thank you. Welcome. Monica, over to you.
Hi, I'm Monika Radzoś. I'm Head of Finance for both Bolsover and BCVS, so managing projects from financial point of view. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Becky, over to you.
Morning, Ian. Thank you. I'm Head of Service here at Bassetlaw CVS.
Thanks, Becky. Annie, over to you.
Hi, Ian. I'm Annie, and I'm Volunteer Coordinator across Bassetlaw and Bolsover districts.
Brilliant, thank you. I've got someone ISVA. I'm not sure what your name is. I apologise.
Sorry, that comes up as Isva. That's my previous role. I'm Jade. So good morning, everyone. I'm from Sale, based in Chesterfield, and I'm the manager of the Advocacy and Business Service Development. So that covers kind of independent sexual violence advisors and our helpline.
Brilliant, thanks, Jade. That's really helpful. Thank you. And Stephanie, over to you.
Morning, Ian. I'm Stephanie Henry. I'm the Bassetlaw Food Insecurity Coordinator and POV Project Manager.
Brilliant, thanks, Stephanie. And last but not least, Oh, no, I've done Julie, haven't I? Sorry, you've just moved across. Apologies. Okay, so I think we've covered everybody. Is there anyone there that has not had the opportunity to introduce themselves this morning? Okay, so let me move on then to what it is that we're going to be covering in a little bit more detail, both over the 4 weeks and then in my session. So the first session today is about what is project management, and we're going to be covering what steps one has to take in order to start a project. So it's all about the project inception or beginning of a project that I'm going to be focusing on, because I basically think of projects maybe kind of simplistically in 3 main bites. So there's the starting of a project, there's the detailed project planning to make a project successful, and then there's the actual project delivery and implementation, which also involves the closure of the project as well. So next week, you're going to have my colleague, Michael Reed, who is my deputy here at Inspire Learning. And Michael is also very steeped in project delivery and writing successful applications for funding, etc. So he will be taking you through the important stage of project planning. That will be next week. And then in 3 weeks' time, my colleague, Nikki Reed, no relation to Michael, different spelling. She's EE rather than EI. And Nikki is our head of adult learning. So she's responsible for all of our non-accredited and accredited adult learning. Again, she's successfully completed the project management training by from the Association of Project Management, which is what we're broadly basing our delivery on over the 3 sessions. And she's going to talk about the important part of actually delivering a project and making sure the project is successful and that it meets its deliverables and the beneficiaries and the project stakeholders are all satisfied at the end, and how you bring a project to a successful conclusion. And then in the final session in 4 weeks' time, it's back to me, I'm afraid, and I will be wanting to do a detailed kind of recap, because there's a lot of ground that we will have covered over those 3 weeks. And then we will have an assessment exercise. Don't get too frightened about the assessment exercise, but it's an attempt to ensure that we can test that what we have been delivering to you throughout the course of the 3 weeks. And there will be opportunities, like at the end of today, I'm going to be doing a quiz, so I'll give you a heads up warning, there's a bit of a quiz coming. There will be opportunities throughout the course of the 3 weeks prior to the final week to also test your understanding. But it's important that actually with something like project management knowledge, it's one of those ones a bit like a mathematics subject that kind of builds on previous things that have been covered. So it's helpful to, I think, at the end of it, check to make sure that you've understood and that you've got that. And we can then also, if necessary, if there are gaps in people's knowledge as a result of what we've covered, perhaps because we haven't covered it as well as we might, then one of the advantages of this approach that we're taking, which is as we say, with kind of co-producing, we can come back and I'm offering this to Andrea now, we can come back and do a kind of a follow-up session if necessary, if there are areas that need to be picked up on. I'm very happy to do that as well, because I think that would be good and helpful for us. So we may come back for a 5th bite of the cherry if that's required. But if not, if everyone's knowledge is there and everyone's covered it very well, and we'll issue some kind of end of the 4-week certification to you all as well, that would be nice to have, just as a kind of an indication that you've successfully completed. So are there any questions that anyone would like to ask about what we're envisaging will be the kind of the project management going forward? Great. So next one from me then. I've actually said find a partner, but I'm not sure how that's going to work here, because I'm not sure if I can actually put you into small groups. That would have been easy, I think, if we were via Zoom, but there are often other technical issues regarding Zoom, so I think it's probably better to do this in Teams. So what I would suggest is if you could do this on your own, unfortunately, but think about your experience to date of projects, because I'm sure, having listened to all of your introductions, projects, I don't think I'm talking to an audience here who are in any way new to projects. So I think this is going to be, for a lot of you, a kind of a revision of things that you already know. Andrea, sorry.
Ian, just because we've got a range of colleagues in the room, it's probably helpful if we can define what we mean by a project for the purpose of the course before we have those discussions, if that
Yeah, okay, well that's my next slide, so here I go.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
Otherwise you might get the wrong answer.
No, that's absolutely fine. Bear with me. So yeah. So what is a project? What is it that makes a project, and how is that different from business as usual? Because that's how we normally would define a project, is by differentiating it from business as usual. So a project then is normally a temporary thing with a defined start and an end date. So that's one of the key characteristics that makes a project. It also has normally a dedicated set of resources. That can actually be funding, it can actually be staff resources, it could be access to equipment, but it's actually going to have its own dedicated set of resources to enable it to achieve its objectives. It will also, as a project, have something known as a project life cycle, and I'm going to come back and talk about that a little bit more later on today, and you'll hear a lot more about that from both Michael and Nikki on week 2 and week 3. And as I've already kind of touched upon, a project will have a unique product with a defined purpose that it's been designed to actually deliver. So there will be some key deliverables, as we call them, that the project is there to undertake. And we can contrast that to what's known as business as usual, or BAU, because that's the kind of standard day-to-day operations of an organization that happens anyway, that is the kind of normal operations of the organization that happens to maintain its running. And that could include things like monthly reports, maybe operating an IT help desk, maybe doing support for various service users. So like Jade, for example, was talking about particular client groups, and others I know of you are involved in face-to-face support for clients. So those things would all be the kind of business as usual. So one of the things that's kind of important about project management as an approach is that it can also help, and I'll talk about this in more detail a bit later on, but I think I'll raise it now. It can also be very helpful in changing what the new business as usual is, because if you do a successful project and you've delivered all of the deliverables, then what can happen at the end of that, it doesn't always happen, it depends on the nature of the project, but what can happen is that the new business as usual, once the project is finished, is actually different because it incorporates elements perhaps of the project that's just been completed, so that the new business as usual isn't what it was when you started the project. You've actually changed and moved the needle so that business as usual has been redefined. And that's why project management and project approaches are being increasingly used, because it's a very successful way of introducing change management to any organization by taking a project management approach. But again, we'll come on to that in a little bit more detail. So going back to I hope that's helpful in terms of helping you to kind of think about your own experience. But I think it's really helpful to hear from you, because it's part, as I say, of that whole sharing. What have been your experiences of projects? Because I'm sure we all of us have had some very good experiences of projects. We've probably had some very poor experiences where things have gone very wrong, and even ugly ones where it's gone so wrong it's kind of one of those dreadful experiences that we hope never to repeat in our professional lives. And projects have a tendency, because of their nature, because they're not business as usual, because they are introducing change and they involve management of tricky things like resources and people against time, they have a tendency to kind of go wrong. Andrea, sorry.
Thank you. I think that is helpful, because we hear lots of definitions, different definitions. I just wanted to flag before colleagues share any experiences, just to remind you, we are recording. This will be in the public domain, so be mindful of that when you feedback about the ugly.
Yes, absolutely. A good reminder, Andrea. Thank you. So I'll give you a moment or two just to kind of think about those, but then and I'll also I'm going to take part in this as well, so I'll be able to share some of my experiences with you, because I've had some excitements along the way, as I'm sure we all have, when it comes to projects, things that have gone very well and things that have gone not quite so well, things that have gone disastrously wrong as well. So I'll give you a couple more minutes just to kind of jot down your ideas and think about your experiences, because it's interesting to hear from colleagues what their experiences of projects have been, I think. Okie dokie. Any colleagues want to be brave and go first? Any volunteers to share? Could be, yeah, Steve, over to you. Thanks, Steve.
Hello. So I go back to a project that I was involved with in 2012, and it involved bringing together two large statutory organisations, one with an occupational health background and the other one with an employability background. And the purpose of the project was to support people with low-level mental health to either stay in work or return to the workplace. That was the remit. There were some targets set that we were meant to do over the year, but there was no systems or practice in place at all. We worked with a number of occupational therapists and employability specialists, and to say the two didn't get along would be interesting. And I think, personalities aside, there definitely needed to be some joined up thinking when this contract was first rolled out, and there wasn't. It was just, it came out. Lots of people were brought together. This is the targets. This is what we want you to do over the course of a year. And for the first quarter, it was a nightmare. However, I think what we did do, and this is the good practices that we did put in place, we realised quite quickly that there was duplication happening. The occupational therapists were doing the same as the employability workers. The employability workers were doing the same as the occupational therapists. So we brought them together. We talked about a linear way of working, a structured way of working, about who would do what to what point before they were handed over to each one. We then put Gantt charts in place about where we wanted to get to by month 4, by month 5, and month 6, and then to the end of the project. We had, to start off with, to get us back on track with where we were with our targets, we had weekly intervention meetings with all members of staff to air their views, and that then made it a much more cohesive way of working. And to cut a very long story short, the project was really successful and was funded for a further 5 years. But it had lots and lots of issues to begin with because there wasn't them structures in place. I hope that helps.
That's really helpful, Steve, and I think it's a really good observation, and I think it demonstrates what actually can happen quite often with externally funded projects is that they have to kind of Lucy, your hand's raised. They have to, you know, the externally funded projects can sometimes be rushed in their implementation because often the kind of external funders' timescales are kind of a little bit unrealistic, and that can lead to the kind of issues that you're talking about, Steve. But it's interesting to see that you also saw those issues then be kind of resolved, and that there were ways in which, you know, where you'd had competing colleagues from different cultures, I would imagine, who didn't probably understand each other and see eye to eye, over time they were able to resolve those differences, and it was possible through, you know, you've mentioned Gantt charts, will be something that we'll come on to. I won't be talking about those too much this session, but they'll be touched on, well, covered much more thoroughly next week by Michael as he talks about project planning, because obviously that's a key tool to help with project planning. So yeah, I can see that journey. So thank you for that. It's such a good. You've kind of got you've had the bad, the ugly, the ugly, and then the good sort of thing in terms of that project. So that's great. I'm not sure if it was Stephanie or Lucy. Is it Stephanie? Okay, I'll go to Stephanie and then I'll go to Lucy. Stephanie, over to you.
Yes, so I can resonate a little bit with what Steve's been saying when working with external providers. So one of the projects I'm going to kind of talk around is one of the first things that I did in the BFIN was around slow cooker support and working with an external organisation. And there are great positives of obviously in the third sector of cross partnership working, but sometimes it's just having that knowledge of their working style and getting to know how best to keep in communication and constant contact. So you both understand what the expectations are of the project. Also being flexible. Things may not always go to plan, and knowing kind of what as a plan B if things do alter, which they ultimately do in most projects. And working potentially with strong personalities along the way as well. And also factoring in things out of your control. So on the first low cooker course, unfortunately, the person who was taking it was ill for one of the sessions. So it's kind of bracing yourself for eventualities that can be out of your control and how you will work from that as well. But some of the good things have been outcomes that exceed your expectations. So you might have particular expectations that you expect from a project and they exceed them, and that can be a wonderful feeling, which has happened definitely in the slow cooker course.
That's great. Thanks, Stephanie. That sounds really good. Again, kind of covering the full gamut from the kind of good, bad, and ugly, but ending up with it ending, you know, on a very positive note. And I think, and also I like what you're suggesting about needing to be flexible. I think that's absolutely key to projects in terms of things will go wrong, and it's about having some contingency. And we will touch upon that again next week. Michael, as part of the planning process, will be talking about risk management and issues management and how that can really help to focus your mind and come up with those contingencies that can mitigate risks as well and make the impact of them not as negative as they otherwise would be. So that's really good. Lucy, over to you.
It made me think of my previous roles, and I have got a good middleweight and a bad one. So, but I take Andrew's point. I won't mention any names. It's interesting what you're saying about project management, and if that's as we all see it, is a unique, you know, a unique part of a whole organisation. I was a project manager for a small charity for 5 years, but was actually called project manager, and you make me think it's lots of small projects of making up the whole. And then my outcome at the end, I suppose, was to come to a point when it was just my time to go, to leave the overall organisation, even though I was project manager, in a good place and make it easier for others to take on. But that would be lots of little projects coming together. A middle one is I work for an ERDF funded project to help. This will make people laugh. Pre-start social enterprises, because I thought that was an error when I first went, but it was pre-start. And in itself, it was a learning experience. That was for 3 years. And I've often reflected that it was never evaluated, because for me, it was a great learning experience, one of my best jobs. But I often look at the social enterprises that we set up, and a lot of them don't exist. And I'm not aware that it was ever proper evaluated. You know, like what the starting point is, what do you want to achieve at the end? And there was so much to learn, there's so many good things. But although we were helping pre-start organisations, I don't think they're there now. So that's really sad. And the last one, which is definitely no names is being mentioned, is I went to work for an organisation, all the best intentions in the world to help consortia development for third sector organisations, national organisation. But there was no planning. And I always remember when I started, I said, can I see your business plan? Oh, kept being fobbed off. And what the chap said is he paid for us all to go, the 4 of us, consultants, development consultants. He wanted us to go on the Prince 2 project management course, and that's the first time I was introduced to this. And I thought, this is really good. Anyway, I never actually did. That's another story. But what I'm going to say is, after 2 months, we were made redundant. So I've never had such a short job. But then when things settled down, there was never a project plan. There was never any funding agreement, because I asked can I at least see, you know, your funding agreement? Because it was supposedly with something called Future Builders, but there was never anything in writing. And the danger there was it was a young, enthusiastic, very charismatic person, and he had lots of money. And so he'd actually funded all our posts and everything through his own pot. And I think he'd given himself this deadline, didn't tell us this till afterwards. And after 2 months, he realised that he hadn't got any funding came through. So when you looked at our contract, when we read the small print, they were spot on with their HR, but there was no project management or anything there. And that's quite an interesting anecdote, but I came out of it. That's the only time, well, it's the second time I've been made redundant, but I think it's the shortest job I've ever had. So there you go. That's my good, bad and very bad.
Well, that's really helpful, Lucy. Thank you. And yeah, that experience of only being in the job for kind of a couple of months, but actually the fact that there wasn't a project plan, there wasn't a kind of a funding plan, there wasn't the documentation in place, I think, you know, tells its own story. And I think, you know, unfortunately, you know, planning is kind of very important to project management and its success. And you know, as I say, that will be something we'll touch upon in terms of the starting of projects today, and what, because the initial part of that process is the kind of project inception plan, or the project inception document, which actually wins the support for the project in the first place. And because you mentioned, Lucy, as well, that there weren't even those kind of funding agreements, early stage funding agreements in place. So that absolutely key. You need to have those things in place and nailed down, otherwise things can go catastrophically awry, which unfortunately in that instance they kind of did. Andrew, I think you're next.
I just thought I'd share a good example, because I'm sure we've all got really painful examples and we'll hear more about those throughout the course. But
Sure.
One standout good example for me was where project management methodology was applied properly from start to end around a new website build. And what that meant, and that is kind of a purist version of project management because that's where it all came from really, but what that meant was everything was very clear from day one: budgets, all the controls, who was doing what, by when, targets and KPIs were understood, it progressed, it finished on time, regular reviews. There were bits of slippages, but because those controls were in place, they were identified quickly and acted upon quickly. So I think sometimes it's really helpful to see a good practice example as well from start to end, or understand the benefits it can bring, because it is front end extra work, but it saves you so much work mid and back end. And there are a few of those, sadly, probably more challenging ones than really successful ones, but there are a few good standout ones for me that mean I am always convinced it's worth investing in that.
No, I'd agree, Andrew, and it's good. You're right. I think having good practices, examples for people is good, and it then demonstrates what we were talking about before, about how project management can actually be a really effective method of change management for the organisation. And that project that you've mentioned about bringing in a new website, I mean, once it was up and running and the project finished, the new website becomes the new business as usual, and that website will have had better functionality and will have been better for everybody involved, end users and all of the key participants, than probably the one it replaced, or it may not have even had a website before. So it's a good example of going from, you know, the current state, which is not desirous, not the best outcome, to a new outcome which is actually much better, and it's realized it in a planned and not panicked way, because it was carefully planned and implemented. And even though slight things go awry, they were managed, and the changes were managed as part of a project change process, which again Michael will be talking about next week, about how to manage change within projects, because that's inevitable, but it's how you manage it to make sure it doesn't derail you. So that's good. Thank you. That's a really good example, a positive example. Rachel, over to you.
Hi, I think this is quite a good example as well, because nothing really went majorly wrong with it, but the stuff that did go wrong probably was out of our control anyway, the stuff that was frustrating. So it was when I worked for a large leisure organisation that had 14 leisure centres and 12,000 gym members, that when we went into COVID, all these people, we had to freeze their gym memberships, obviously, because the gyms were all closed, but they all wanted something else. So I was put in charge of a project called Healthy at Home, where we put everything online and put the gym instructors in rooms on their own, completely isolated, doing the gym classes in front of a video screen. And it all had to be organised very, very quickly because people wanted it straight away. Obviously, because of the challenging times of COVID, things changed all the time, so that didn't help. But it did go well, and it ended up getting rolled out at the end of when all the restrictions stopped and the gyms opened again. There was a lot of people that said, actually, I quite like having the option of being able to do stuff in my home. I'm happy to have my membership back, but I want the option of still being able to do stuff in my front room when I want to. So they ended up rolling out a portal, an on-demand portal, where people could still do that and then rewatch videos after and things like that. And it became part of their membership. I think they charged an extra £5 or something, in case people didn't want it. It was like an optional add-on. So it ended up being very successful in the sense that they continued it. But I say the frustrations were, it was quite lonely due to the nature of it being during COVID, and I was doing a lot of it from home. And then obviously tech issues were quite a big challenge, because the instructors that are gym instructors, some of them weren't particularly knowledgeable on tech. So trying to tell them how to turn a camera on or that they're on mute and things like that when you're working from home and miles away, really frustrating. But as a project that went on for longer than expected, because obviously we opened up and then went closed again and opened and closed again and all those sorts of things, I think it was successful in the sense that everybody got good feedback from it. They all enjoyed it, and another good thing was we recorded regular statistics along the way, which really helped evaluate it at the end. So we knew exactly how many people attended each class, which classes were more popular. And as we went along, if we found out one class was like getting 20 people on it, whereas another class was only getting 3, we would swap around and things like that along the way, so that we were, catering for what people actually wanted. And we did a survey as well at the end and asked the gym users, what did you think of it? What would you change? What did you like about it? And that was really useful to get the feedback at the end as well for evaluation.
Great, that sounds like a really, really good, again, very positive example, and also showing how kind of, adversity can be the kind of mother of invention, and actually as a result of the pandemic, actually coming up with new services, which then actually is, again, another example of becoming the new business as usual. So a project that starts as a change project, and which is something new and innovative, actually changes into becoming the new business as usual for the gym, because even after the pandemic finished, people actually liked it and wanted it, and it became a new benefit and service that was offered to the gym users. So I think that's a really excellent example, Rachel, as well. Thank you for that. It's really, really positive. That's really good. Kirsty, over to you.
Hi, I was a radio station manager for a couple of years for a community radio station in Rotherham, and the funding was already in place when I got the position, and all the KPIs and everything was set before I arrived. And it had been set up by the music project manager, and I was the radio manager. So at times I was in charge, and at other times the project manager of the music project decided he was in charge. So he'd if we had a disagreement, he would then override that decision. It got to the point where I'd got experience of radio and he hadn't, and so there were some of the technical things that they'd put down in the funding bid weren't appropriate. He wouldn't let me alter that. So when he went on annual leave, I got in touch with the funders and had a good discussion with them, explained my case, put a report together and managed to get those changed to what's needed. And I gather some of the equipment's still in use now, because it was a 2-year project and it ended up that we got a full-time radio station license. But it was a really interesting project. But one of the issues was the personalities of people, because it was community based. There was work in schools, there was work with youth centres, there was work with the local community. So we had to have regular meetings and training and things. And there's some strong personalities and some strong views of things, and quite sexist personalities that I experienced. So it was one of those projects where I was really pleased with the outcome, but I was very glad to go and do something different. But another more negative one was an Aperture TV company, which I was involved in the setting up of that, and the personalities and the what people wanted to expect from it, the expectations weren't great, and in the end it kind of floundered and kind of just dive bombed eventually. So that was one where, because people weren't clear of the outcomes and people had different ideas where they wanted to go with it, it never really came to anything. So yeah, quite a mixed bag, and I think it's hard when you're working with other people and their expectations.
That's a really good example, Kirsty. Thank you. I mean, obviously the first project was successful and has had a legacy, which is really good, but that there were some negative elements to it. And I think the fact that you're also putting a stress on the importance of who the people are that you're working with, both in terms of within your organisation, but also external stakeholders as well. And that's something that we're going to come on to this morning as well, talking about how you can actually use planning to help to manage the stakeholder relationships more effectively. There's no way of, eradicating all of the kind of difficulties that may come along, because sometimes they're there and you have to deal with them, but it's much better if they're planned for, and if you actually have a plan for trying to mitigate them and to come up with solutions. In fact, you did, in terms of waiting for their colleague to be on leave and then going to the funder. So that was quite effective. I will share one example that I think had both good and bad within it, and possibly some ugly. Was a big ERDF project that I was involved with when I worked for Park Lane College, Leeds. And this was around establishing an incubator in the main building within the college, and that was ERDF funded, but also ESF funded. So there was kind of a combination of European funding pots, and there were some issues around explaining the project, in fact, to colleagues was one of the key things that I found difficulty. So kind of getting the project initiation phase was tricky. And sometimes what would happen, because it was externally funded, the pace of that would suddenly quicken and you'd suddenly have the green light given to the funding application faster than you'd anticipated. And at times that would then mean that I hadn't done, and this was down to me, I hadn't done sufficient groundwork with colleagues across the college to prepare them for the fact that there was going to be something happening very imminently. And that caused some difficulty, because suddenly the pace of change was being kind of dictated by the external funder, and that then caused some difficulties which I was ultimately responsible for not having communicated as effectively. But as a result of the project, we did support new business startups that were successful. And again, this is back in the late noughties, so about 2007-8, and the college, even though it's been through many different iterations as an institution, still has that incubator in its ground floor. And it's still supporting new business startups in Leeds. And it also allowed a new relationship, in fact, with local businesses and entrepreneurs, because they would come in and advise the new business startups. And as a result of that, they also then started to get interested in other parts of what the college was doing. And one example was a guy called Steve Beaver, who was running successful kind of gentlemen's hairdressers salons. He was giving his time pro bono to support the new business startups, but he actually got interested in our hair and beauty provision as well in the college, and gave some invaluable advice. And at the next Ofsted inspection, that area went from being a kind of requires improvement 3 to a grade 1 outstanding. And I think it was not just directly down to that, but it was supported by the input that came from Steve Beaver and his practical industrial experience that he then shared. And that was a really good unintended positive consequence of the project. So projects can have unintended positive impacts on an organisation, but they can also sometimes have unintended negative impacts as well. So that's been really helpful. I think that's been a really good exercise of sharing everybody's understanding of projects. And I think that we will need to go back to some of that throughout the course of not just today, but the other sessions as well, as we try and ensure that what we're building on is on your experience and expertise, because it's obviously, this is not your first rodeo. Andrea, sorry, over to you.
I was just going to clarify, and I probably will keep doing this, because language is important in terms of how we're using it and how we use it consistently to all mean the same thing. That when I talk about projects, that's different from contracts, and sometimes a single contract is run as a project, but sometimes multiple contracts feed into one project. Sometimes each contract has to be managed by a project. So they're not the same is the point I'm making for colleagues in BCVS, and we'll use that this methodology to unpick what type of tools we apply to contracts, what we apply to projects, what we programs, what we apply to business as usual. And the aim of this is to get us all on the same page and working to the same rulebook game of project management. Colleagues from outside of BCVS, apologies, you may hear some BCVS specific stuff, but that will hopefully be of use for you in your
No, I'm sure it will. I'm sure it will, Andrew. Absolutely, for colleagues who are not from BCVS as well. So that's helpful. Thank you for that. Yeah, and you're right. Contracts and projects, I do think they are separate. I mean, they're linked, but yeah, I have my definition of project is what I've just sort of shared before we had the exercise, and that's what I'm going to kind of keep referring back to. Kirsty, is that a legacy hand or is that it's a legacy hand? That's fine. Excellent. So let's move on then from thinking about, you know, our approaches and experiences of project management, and we've just talked a little bit about the definition as well. Let's move to who are some of the kind of key roles within project management and project delivery? Well, there are some kind of generic roles, and I'm going to talk a little bit about these in a little bit more detail that you will find. And again, these will be picked up again by colleagues, Michael next week talking about the project planning, and also by Nikki in the third week talking about the project implementation. But it's also useful to have a kind of a clear understanding and definition of these various roles. Before I kind of go through and say what I think they are, would anyone like to have a go at defining the first one, project sponsor? Does anyone want to have a bash and say what they think project sponsor, what the role might be and what that might involve? Hey, no takers for that one. Okay, so a project sponsor is someone who initiates a project, who actually is responsible for winning the support for that project, and actually acts as the advocate for the project, not just at the inception, although they have an important role to play at the inception, but the project sponsor ought to be responsible for acting as the kind of advocate and champion for the project all the way through the project's life cycle through to its conclusion. And the project sponsor will, in working with the project manager, have a responsibility also for, where it's appropriate, making sure that the post-project business as usual, if it does changes appropriately, and that the benefits that the project has delivered are then realized in the new business as usual. So it's quite an important role, and the key document that the project sponsor will use in order to win the approval for their project will be some form of project initiation document, or PID as it's sometimes referred to, and that will be the project that will be the document, sorry, that will outline what the project is, what its kind of key deliverables are, and will actually act as a summation of the project, which will then influence the subsequent more detailed project management plan. So that's the project sponsor. Are there any questions that you'd like to ask me about that particular role before I move on to project manager? Okay, so yes, Andrew, sorry. Go for it.
Because it presents challenges, risks and issues in itself. What happens when a project sponsor leaves an organisation? And well, I'm not asking what happens, I'm asking what the way to deal with that is by following management system.
I think it's important that there needs to be a new project sponsor put in place. I don't think you should leave it as a kind of a vacancy. I think that can be a real problem, because then that puts too much emphasis on, I think what will tend to happen then is that the organisation will have a tendency to think that the project sponsor and the project manager become synonymous. And I don't think that's a good idea. I think it's helpful to have the project sponsor be separate from the project management role. So my advice would be, even if there's a situation where the project sponsor leaves the organisation or for whatever reason can't continue to function as the project sponsor, you need to find someone who can. And that someone shouldn't, in my opinion, be the project manager, because I think the role of project sponsor and the role of project manager are quite distinct, and both of them are quite difficult roles. And it's the project sponsor that needs to ultimately not only win permission for the project in the outset, but throughout the life of the project, advocates for that project. So if and when the project manager goes to their project sponsor and says, such and such an element of the project is now having a problem, and it might be around resources, it might be something to do with the project that's a serious issue, where it will require kind of the organization's senior management to make a decision to support that project manager's request. The project manager will identify the issue, raise it to the project sponsor, but it's the project sponsor's responsibility to then go to the kind of organization's senior management, and or if it's multiple, if it's complex project, whatever the main project board is, and actually win from that the actual approval to do the necessary changes. And I don't think it's fair or works very well if you ask the project manager not only to manage the project, identify the risks and issues, come up with the problems, but also have to go and win that kind of high level approval to sort the things out. That can't, I don't think that works very well in practice. And I think this can be one of the problems that can kind of cause difficulties for projects, is not clearly having a project sponsor, in fact, and not clearly defining what his or her role is in terms of advocating on behalf of the project. So I think it's I think you're right to ask the question, Andrew, and it's a good one, because I think it is.
I just want to come back and I'll probably, for the sake of people watching recordings, keep clarifying. Of all the different project management tools out there, and this course draws on several of them, no one methodology. There is different language used within different tools. And in others, you'll hear about project executive, which has a slightly different role, but overlap with sponsors. So I'm sure we'll come to that later in terms of the governance rather than the sponsor and leading that role through. But if anything sounds unclear, or you think, oh, well, I thought that was called something else, let's just have that discussion, because we all need to be using the same terms in the same way for the purpose of this learning experience and the methods we go on to apply.
That's a good point. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, there are different, obviously, approaches to project management. I'm following, as I say, one that is the Association of Project Management approach, because I like it, because it draws upon a lot of the others, whereas there are different types and approaches. We've already touched on Prince2, and there are others that we're going to talk about in a second. But what I like about the Association of Project Management approach is that it kind of pulls from each, and it says that the project manager and the project sponsor should determine which are the most effective tools dependent upon what type of project it is, and it doesn't specify which one is appropriate. It says that it's part of the project management process, and the initiation is to decide which would be the most appropriate type of approach to take for particular types of project, because there are different approaches that would be more appropriate. So thank you. Kirsty, you've got your hand up, sorry.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the project sponsor bit. It's not a term I'm particularly familiar with, but I imagine that the sponsor and the manager both have to be on the same page with things. And I think that's possibly where I've personally experienced issues where, like I said, with the radio project, I presume he would be the project sponsor then had applied for the funding and written down the parameters of what was to be achieved. And whilst the ultimate thing was to get a full-time license, which was achieved, the bits in between weren't right and didn't fit right and weren't suitable to kind of get to that goal. So as the project manager, I suppose that the project sponsor is the one who initiates it in the first place. Is that right? And perhaps applies for the funding with a board of trustees or whoever it might be that they're taking with them, but they're the ones that kind of get the thing going in the first place. So I think it's really important that the project manager and the project sponsor are really understanding of what's expected, because I think that's where it can split off if they both got different ideas or different experience.
That's a good point, Kirsten. Obviously, in reality, things don't always work as smoothly as they will do in the kind of, as we're talking about it here, in the theoretical world of what it ought to be perfectly. But what I think, you need to have, and your example of the radio is a good one. And I do think the person that probably applied for the funding and won the approval for that in the first instance was the project sponsor. The difficulty, I think, was that then they had got involved in starting to do the planning as well, which is actually a role that should be the project manager's responsibility. And I don't think that obviously that hadn't been clearly delineated enough. So I think that the project sponsor in the example you mentioned, Kirsty, in the radio, was kind of almost stepping outside of their role a little bit and extending their role into also being the project manager. And that's why I think it's important to try to keep the project sponsor and the project manager roles distinct, because it's the project manager's responsibility as well. Coming on to this now, the project manager's got the responsibility ultimately for managing the project, and that involves planning and ensuring that the resources are deployed appropriately to achieve the key deliverables of that project over its lifetime. And that's the project manager's key responsibility, and the project sponsor should only be involving his or herself in a way that actually helps the project manager to achieve the objectives of the project plan, and not to go against it in any way, because that's counterproductive. So I think in your instance, unfortunately, the kind of project sponsor had already kind of done a outline project management plan, which they were then determined to stick to, even though actually it may not have been the most appropriate project management plan to achieve the objectives.
I'm just wondering whether the sponsor needs to, if they're not fully au fait with what's needed, because I think it was a case of, oh, this funding's appeared, let's go for it kind of thing, and write the bid, which obviously they were successful in. But I think if he got more, actually conferred with people of expertise to say what is actually needed, what should we focus on, because some of the things that they'd ordered weren't accessible for people. And if you're working with all members of the community, to give people a chance to and opportunities, then you need to make sure that you've got the right equipment. You can't just go with one thing, and obviously more accessible equipment is often more expensive. So I think being a project sponsor, I think sometimes, and we've had it, funding comes in last minute, doesn't it? And it's like, quick, get this bid together. But I think unless you've got the right people, especially if you're kind of trying to price everything up, I think it's worth trying to make sure you've got that expertise in there. But I think hindsight's a great thing, isn't it?
Absolutely. Hindsight's 2020, Kirsty, always, absolutely. But I think, I think it's good to understand the distinct roles, and the fact that effectively, as I say, your example's a good one, because I think your project sponsor strayed into project management. And I think that, what we're saying is that's not appropriate. The project sponsor is there to kind of win approval, and that might mean funding as well, as it did in this case, but it's winning the approval for the project and then acting as an advocate. But the project manager should be the one who has the expertise to actually deliver that project and manage the project, and the sponsor is there to basically kind of troubleshoot for them, because the sponsor should be the person you go to as a project manager to say, I'm having difficulties with X or Y, and if it requires say more senior intervention, the sponsor takes that on and advocates on behalf of the project and supports the project manager to they shouldn't be kind of countermanding or going in a different direction to the project manager. So the project manager then is going to plan the project. He's going to there should initially be a project initiation document, or PID, that has been developed, and the project manager may or may not have an involvement in that, because it depends whether he or she's around at that point. But at the point when they are brought in to manage the project, they need to look back at all of that documentation. They need to know what the initiation of the project is all about and what the kind of core objectives of the project are, and then it's their responsibility to plan the project and to talk and think about the resource allocation for the project and against time, so that the project can hopefully deliver what it needs to for the other kind of key people that are involved in projects. The next point, I mean, we'll talk more about the project manager throughout the 3 days. It'll certainly be a key focus for both Michael and Nikki, but it's also, it's a key focus today as well, although the project sponsor's probably going to be more of a focus for me this morning. The next one is service continuity manager. Now, this may not be appropriate in every instance, but in the projects where we're talking about, for example, the move from, there's a business as usual, but there's a business case for a project to actually do something new and different. That's then been initiated, the project's happened. When the project is concluded, there might be, as let's take Andrea's example as one to illustrate what I mean. If there was the website project and it was completed, that became the new business as usual operating that new website. There must have been somebody who had the assigned responsibility for looking after that new website and making sure that it operated effectively. And that person would be the new service kind of continuity manager, because it's the point at which sometimes I think projects can fail is almost at the end. If you've made a change that means that there's a new business as usual, if there isn't someone who has got the responsibility to take the changed business as usual and make that be embedded within the organization, the danger is that it becomes undelivered and it becomes kind of a bit messy. And even though the project within its time frame and it's worked completely effectively, if you haven't then made the effective transition to the new business as usual, you can actually kind of snatch defeat from the jaws of victory even at the final furlong, by not having someone who's clearly responsible for ensuring that the benefits from the project and the new business as usual get embedded. Andrea, sorry, I'll stop. Sorry, I think you're on mute. Apologies. Sorry,
thank you. I win the prize today, first one. It just reminded me of that cliche of projects are where good ideas go to die, because that's what happens if you don't have that continuity planned. But the point I was actually going to make was in small organisations, and this is the benefit of co-design, we need to be mindful that often these functions and roles and responsibilities may be carried out by the same person. Yes. And that in the example of a website project, for example, in our organisation, our internal project manager for that would be Rachel. She would also be in charge of continuity after the end of the project and business as usual. So, and that sometimes happens with management roles as well. You might be the manager and doing some of the delivery as well. So just to flag, in this co-design process, we need to be mindful in very small organisations. Sometimes one person's performing multiple roles, but that they need to understand that they're very different stages and different roles with different outcomes attached to them.
Yeah, they almost have to wear kind of different hats, don't they, at the different stages? Because you are right, you're right, Andrew. It could be that the project sponsor and the project manager and the service continuity manager could, for a project, if it's a smaller project or it's a small organisation, that could all be one and the same person. I mean, they would have to wear different hats for the different functions as they perform them, but they need to know that they're wearing those separate hats at different stages in the life cycle of the project. So thank you, it's a good point. Yes, I'm thinking probably from my experience within Inspire, where we have a bit more, perhaps, we're a bit bigger, so we would normally have a service. But in some instances, because we have gone through a number of projects internally as part of our kind of attempt to move to a more systematic project management approach within Inspire, which we are on a journey towards. So we haven't reached that yet. We haven't reached the nirvana, but we're on that journey to try and be more project management focused in how we manage all of our projects across Inspire. And we have one of the key things, at least, is the exercise of just identifying the project sponsor, the project manager, and the service continuity manager. Just that exercise itself has been really, really helpful and has focused the minds, because what can sometimes be the case, can't it, is that things get a bit woolly and nobody is actually in the hot seat. And if nobody's in the hot seat, then if it's not a designated person, the danger can be nobody takes that responsibility on and things don't get done. And that's been our experience. So yes, but I take the point.
And just to qualify, even for the smallest micros that we support, it's very useful to work to this discipline. I firmly believe that. That's why we're doing it. That's why we're investing in it. And there should always be that separation between the governance, exec, sponsor function and delivery. And that can be through your board of trustees as a micro organisation, only employing one organisation. So that exercise is very, very useful, whatever scale you work at. But yeah, we need to be mindful of, we work with a lot of very small organisations where they don't have that.
No, absolutely. So again, the next one, the project delivery team may not be something which you have the luxury of having. And again, it may be the same individual that's the sponsor, the manager, the service continuity manager, and may also be the person doing the actual heavy lifting of the delivery team. But if you have got more resources, perhaps you may have other people who are involved. And we'll talk about some of the challenges with that, though, because quite often the project manager won't necessarily be in a project, and quite often isn't that person or the project delivery team's line manager, but is actually required to manage those people for the purposes of the project. And that in itself presents a very big project a people management challenge. And again, there's no magic bullet there. There's not a magic way of solving those issues. However, one of the things is to be aware of them and to understand them, and to understand what that means in terms of how a project manager has to manage people who aren't their direct reports, but you have to actually be able to influence them to achieve the objectives of the project, because you do manage them for the purposes of their time on the project. So that's a challenge we'll come to. Then there are stakeholders, and we will be coming on to stakeholders in a little bit more detail later on, but there are a number of different stakeholders depending on the project, and there will be both internal and external stakeholders for a project, and it's very useful to identify who they are and to have a plan for managing them, because that's part of making this project a success through the effective and successful management of the stakeholders' expectations, so that they don't think that they're going to get more than they're going to get, and they don't think they're going to get it quicker than they're going to get it, and then because that will be the key thing that will lead to dissatisfaction with any project. And often it's because of a miscommunication. So the effective communication with stakeholders is key to then making sure a project feels like it's a success, because quite often projects are successful, but they don't feel like they are because the stakeholders felt that they were going to get something different, perhaps better than was actually ever going to be offered or delivered. So it's absolutely crucial that they understand what it is that's happening. And then last but no means least, the end users and the final participants, beneficiaries in the project are key, because they are actually often, depending on the project, who the project is intended to support. So take Kirsty's project with the radio, the end users and ultimate participants with the community that the community radio was going to benefit and support. And as you said, Kirsty, that if you took the definition of community in its widest sense, then that informed key decisions about how you did the project, because that would lead you to buy more expensive equipment that would allow people from the community who may have some disabilities and other issues to actually access that radio, which if you don't think about it and put in place the steps, they will then not have the opportunity to access that service. And similarly with Rachel, in terms of the website project that she was obviously involved with, you would have been thinking right the way through about what the end user experience was going to be. And I'm sure at some stage in the website you will have had kind of some kind of user interface with it before it was finalized, when it was still in a kind of a sandbox stage, to actually get their user feedback on what they liked about it, what they didn't like about it, so that you could actually ensure that the website was successful and was meeting the objectives of the end users. So that
definitely UX testing is really important, because when you've worked on something for so long and you've like practically helped build it, especially a website, you get very used to, as a person and as an employee of the website, of where everything is and where things are and how to find things. And many times I've got my husband involved and said, right, can you just go and try and find a gym class on a Wednesday, or can you try and find out where volunteering is on our website? And it's amazing the feedback you get when you think you know where everything is, but it's very, very different to other people. So that is a really important part of the early process, so that you get it right.
No, it's good. I think and I think that would, I mean, obviously applies with websites, but it actually applies to a lot of projects. And one of the things I think that's key to the success of projects is to think about, as a project manager, how you will involve your end users and your kind of intended beneficiaries throughout the project, so that you get their feedback, so that you absolutely, because the insight that you get, isn't it, is brilliant, and you get things you wouldn't have otherwise have thought of, and you can incorporate that into the project and make the project much more successful than it otherwise would have been. So that's really helpful. So we're now going to talk a little bit about, I think I've touched on this, the various different types of approaches to project management and the various kind of tools, some of which you may have come across. And so and my this is me, and not everyone would agree with this approach, but this is, as I say, the kind of the Association of Project Management approach, and it's the one that I feel is kind of the right one for me, and that's why I'm going to kind of advocate to you today. And Michael and Nikki will be following a similar approach next week and the following week, and then when we come together on the 4th week to look at it over but there is no kind of right approach to project management, but what there is actually using various tools and approaches so that you actually have the right approach to suit your particular project. So there's a range of kind of tools effectively that are out there in project management to assist and approaches, and it's being able to be knowledgeable about those and to look into them. And you might have to do a little bit of research to then say, well, what would be the most appropriate approaches for particular types of project. So I've tried to kind of come up with 3 broad types of project, which are the kind of broad categories of project that you will tend to come across in your sorts of organization. So the first one is a complex and sophisticated project that requires a sophisticated level of project management. So it might be that it's a large project, it might have large resources attached to it, and it might be over a longer period of time in order to be successful. And it might involve many stakeholders, it might touch many end users and beneficiaries. So it's a big, chunky, large-scale project that's going to last a long time and be quite complicated and complex. Can anyone come up with a tool that they know of in the project management world that might be an appropriate tool and an appropriate approach for a very complicated, large-scale project? And I'll give you a sneaky hint, it's one that's already been mentioned. Okay, Julie, go for it.
Would it be a Gantt chart?
Gantt chart's one of the tools, absolutely, that you may use, but this is a kind of a broader one of the kind of broader products really, or approaches, which is available for you to kind of use. But Gantt charts would definitely be part of it, Julie, absolutely. Becky?
I don't know what it is, but I've heard Andrea talk about it. Is it Prince?
It is absolutely. It would be Prince or Prince 2. So well done, Becky. Yes. I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail, but I think Prince 2 is an approach. It was developed, I think, in the IT industry originally for big scale infrastructure IT projects. And like everything, it has its strengths and its weaknesses. The strengths of it are that it allows you to manage a very complicated, large-scale project very effectively. And I think Andrew was alluding to the website project that I think Prince 2 was something that you applied the kind of principles of Prince 2 to that web project, I think you mentioned. And, it is a very appropriate tool for the right sort of project. But what would you say, Andrew, are some of the weaknesses of Prince 2 that that might mean that it wouldn't be appropriate for a smaller, shorter scale project? What might be some of its issues?
I'd say, first of all, I never apply the pure model. It's always highly tailored to address some of those weaknesses and issues, and that is that it is time consuming. Does require an additional layer of resource to do it well, and I suppose critics, when they misapply it, would see it as overly bureaucratic. It has, I should say, now been I think mainly treated as the gold standard by the government in terms of the work the government funds. So a lot of education funding and other development type funding uses a Prince 2 methodology, whether or not they explicitly say that. So it's useful in that regard to understand the way the government works in terms of how it manages. But yeah, that's the criticism. Often it's quite time consuming.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. That's true. But I do think you're right. It is a very good, tried and tested approach, and one that we would be wrong not to understand. And we will be touching on elements of Prince2, because the APM model of project management does incorporate some of the approaches, and you'll see like the project initiation documentation and so on are kind of not dissimilar to, or in fact are lifted from the kind of Prince2 methodology along the way. So it is an appropriate one, but it can be time consuming. But again, the investment doing it, and if you apply it appropriately, it is a very good method and approach for managing complicated large projects, and will maximize your chances of doing that successfully. So it's a really good approach. Then there are some shorter efficiency projects which are designed to maybe look at how your current practices and operations are working, and are designed to kind of eliminate waste and maximize the value of what you're doing. I don't know if any of you have come across some of the approaches that can be done for this kind of what I would call bottleneck eradication type projects, where I sometimes call it a brown paper exercise, where you map process maps and then identify where there are bottlenecks in processes, and then take steps to remove those bottlenecks, and thereby increase the efficiency of how things are being managed, and therefore reduce costs and reduce waste and maximize the effectiveness and efficiency of processes. So it's a very useful approach. Has anyone kind of come across that and used that in their practice? See, Andrew's nothing. Sorry,
sorry, I haven't put my hand up. Would they be like quality standards? Because I know to do them properly, it's an awful lot of work, but it does set out the processes of what you're wanting to do.
I think it can involve quality standards, and sometimes quality standards, a bit like Prince2, where as Andrew was saying, some education funding will very much borrow from Prince2 principles. Some quality standards, I think, borrow from these, but there are some kind of project management terms which I've come across, things like, oh sorry, Andrea, sorry.
I don't want to keep giving the example,
no.
So I'll keep waiting, but lean is the one that's most often well known, and bottlenecks are really common term in all of those, because it comes from manufacturing and literally production line analysis. But lean is really
and it was lean that I was kind of thinking of, so thanks, Andrea, for that, because yes, it's an approach. I think it was developed, I think originally by, I'm going to get this wrong, but I think it was either Motorola and or Toyota, because there's a bit of kind of debate about where, but certainly those two organizations were at the early stages of developing this approach. I think Toyota in particular have definitely taken the lean approach to, and there's some bangs and whistles versions where they call it kind of Six Sigma, which is another kind of methodology that's really applicable in manufacturing. But the lean approach is something you'll hear, and again, it's something which the APM, there are some aspects of that are there within the APM approach, and which are useful, and they can be very helpful when trying to focus on process and elimination of waste and maximization of efficiency. And that might be an element within a larger, more complex project. So it's quite complicated, because you might be using a Prince2 methodology for the main objective, but within it you might actually have elements where taking a lean approach is also appropriate. So none of these things are, what's the word for it? You don't have to just apply one approach to a project. You can apply multiple approaches, and that's why I like the Association of Project Management approach, because it encourages you as a project manager to, if you like, as I say, utilize the right tools at the right time to get the objectives that you want, which is that the project meets its objectives within budget and time. And then there are smaller projects, sometimes over a much shorter time period, and there are some project management approaches which can be appropriate for, and I'm thinking here where the project duration may be, weeks or months, or so yeah, I'm sorry, I'm seeing some questions in the chat about what is lean. What I will do is I will provide some kind of a bit of a bibliography after this, if that's helpful, and possibly a quick glossary would be useful as well, I think. So I'll do a quick glossary and a quick bibliography for the end of this. to kind of cover, and with some links for people to follow as well, for you to have a quick read. But I mean, I've got at home, literally there's a kind of a, I mean, I don't know if you've had the For Dummies range of books, but I've got Lean for Dummies on my shelves back at home. So there, I find that very helpful because yeah, it is good. I find it takes it, you know, to first principles in a way that I found very interesting and good. I quite like the For Dummies range of publications. So can anyone name an example of an approach to sort of kind of much shorter duration project? And I will go to Andrea.
Heard me cursing this one. I hate it.
Well, I've Googled Ian. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. It does.
Okay. Because I don't know, but I have Googled Scrum is one that seems to come up.
Yeah.
Kanban, I don't know what that is. Scrumban.
Don't know that. No, I've not come across that one.
No, Lean came in there as well, but that was, I was trying to look for things, but I don't know is the answer. But there do seem to be an awful lot, is kind of what I'm kind of learning very quickly, immediately.
Yeah, I'm not sure, Becky, if I'm right, and I'll check with Andrea to make sure that she agrees with me. I hope she will, because I may be wrong. But the one I would use for this kind of as a, I mean, you're right, Scrum and so on, but I think they're particularly more associated with IT projects in particular. And these ones, again, did come out of IT projects, just like Prince2 did. But it's agile is the kind of, if you like, the universal blanket term that I would be using for these sorts of projects would be agile projects. So, okay, so I'm conscious of time because I've kind of got more I need to get. I need to. This is me talking to myself. I need to crack on, I think. So I'm going to do less talking and more cracking on. So I hope that's helpful. So these are the different types of approaches to project management that one can take. And what I'm trying to get across to you is that there isn't one size fits all here, and that there are tools and there are approaches which are appropriate. And that I like the association of project management approach because it suggests that you as the project sponsor or the project manager should pick an approach that's appropriate for the project you're trying to deliver. But the broad parameters that I'm about to outline and that we'll be picking up next week and the following week are kind of an amalgam probably of some of these approaches. So another thing to think about is types of organization, because how you apply projects will also be influenced by the type of organization that you are. And I don't know whether there's probably more, again, sophisticated approaches than this, but my approach is to think that there are broadly 3 types of organization. I'm sure there are subtle differences and there's probably more, but I'm lumping them. So apologies, it's a crude lumping here, but I'm lumping organizations into 3 broad types. So I'm saying there's kind of hierarchical or functional organizations. Then there are project organizations and there are matrix organizations. In reality, you won't find that there are too many examples that are completely one of those things, but there are some examples that I can think of that are. I will now explain a little bit about what those terms mean, and then I'm going to ask you what you think about your own organizations and what might be some of the strengths and weaknesses of those approaches to when it comes to project management in particular. So hierarchical and functional organizations, I suppose the kind of purest example of that would probably be like the armed services. I mean, that's where you've got, you know, a very clear command structure. You've got a very functional approach to how departments are organized, often along functional lines, with a kind of a head of a department and then, you know, members of that team who've got functional responsibilities going throughout. And you then have a kind of a top structure with the kind of normally either a board or some kind of top layer, and then you've got often a chief executive and then a kind of a very senior management team, and then you've got your kind of functions going out, and you've seen it in the kind of structure charts as that kind of, you know, the one at the top, then the ones across the top, and then ones going down in columns. That's your hierarchical or functional organization. As I say, the kind of purest form of that would probably be something like, you know, the army. almost like the polar opposite of that is a project organization, which I suppose the purest example of that might be something like a TV production company that's one of those kind of private TV production companies that comes together to just deliver a particular program. I don't know if it's Poldark or something, and they will be commissioned by whoever it is that makes the TV program, but they'll be brought together as a group of people with key functions within that team to actually deliver that particular project, which will be, in this instance, filming Poldark. And, you know, you've got camera operators, you've got sound operators, you've got costume, you've got all of the different technical departments within that, but it's a kind of a project team. And I think that's quite a pure version of that. And it comes together only when the project's commissioned. It then delivers the project, which is Poldark. And then at the end of Poldark, when it's been shot, then they just disperse, because they're not kind of likely to be employed apart from being the project team that delivers Poldark, if that makes sense. And they're often people that are kind of, who were in that game will be kind of gigging, won't they? So the camera operator will then try and get another gig in another project to make another TV show. But each project is its own team coming together to do its own thing. And then Matrix is a kind of a hybrid between those two, where you have a more hierarchical structure, but you might have, for the particular purposes of a project, you might have a project manager and a project delivery team with a sort of dotted line between the project manager and some of the colleagues who are going to help deliver the project deliverables. And that can be across the organization and across the kind of functional silos, and would actually be around delivering the project. So that's the kind of, they're the three. And I'm trying to think of an example of a matrix organization, and I can't easily think of one. I think lots of organizations that are in fact pretty hierarchical like to think of themselves as being matrix organizations because it might seem more politically palatable, but in reality, when you actually scrape the surface, they're pretty hierarchical, really. Okay, so are there any questions you'd like to ask me about those sort of definitions? Do you agree, Andrea, that they are kind of the three main lumps of organisations, or can you think of a fourth? Sorry.
Off the top of my head, sorry, I'll drink my tea.
No, that's fine. No, I'm putting you on the spot. Sorry,
No,
but you're happy with that as a kind of a yeah, that's good. So I think if you think about your own organisation, how would you, given my quick definitions, how would you characterise your organisations in that? I'll go first, because there's nothing, you know, there's no issue here. Definitely Inspire is a hierarchical organisation. If you look at our structure charts, you know, there's no doubt that there's a board at the top, then there's Peter as the CEO, there's Inspire leadership team, and then there's a series of functions that come out, and there's three main functions. There's the library function, there's the learning function, and then there's the kind of culture, archives, function, that kind of, they're the three kind of core functions. And then that comes down from the three kind of directors. So there's me, Kirsty and Carol, and then there's the functions that come out of us on the structure chart. So we're definitely hierarchical. We may purport to be matrix because we do occasionally deliver projects, and we might occasionally talk to each other across the silos, but no, we're hierarchical, I would say. So in fact, unequivocally, just look at the structure charts, we definitely are. So what do you think about your own organizations? Would you characterize them in what way? Any takers? Yeah.
Oh, if you like. I'd say SAIL, obviously being a small charity, is hierarchical, even though in some respects you could argue matrix, because we manage different teams. It's definitely, we've got a board that we report to, the director, and then obviously managers within, say, clinical manager, myself under the advocacy, and then helpline as well.
Yeah, that's
hierarchical because of how everything has to go via the board or the director.
Yeah, that sounds kind of quite hierarchical, Jade. Yeah, I think, but there sounds like there might be some matrix working going on as well for projects.
Yeah.
So it's
in terms of different projects and supervision.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So there's and I think that's what you find. A lot of organisations are kind of mainly hierarchical, but there can be some matrix delivery within it as part, especially when it comes to projects. Annie, sorry.
Sorry, I think I would say we're mainly hierarchical. Sorry, I can't even say that word. Because obviously we've got a board and we've got Andrea and then we've got the senior leadership team and then we all work under them. But then again, I suppose we could come under the hybrid because we sometimes have temporary staff or we work with other organisations to pull projects together. So I would say we're mainly, I would like to call us functional rather than
functional. Yeah, functional is better. Yeah, I'm happy with functional. So it's kind of, yeah, it's that function. It is functional, organised in functions, as Jade was describing, as you're saying, Annie, absolutely. But then also a bit like Jade, there will be some projects, and it seems like there's some matrix working as well that happens in the organisation as well. So that's good. So and how do you, well, let's first, can you think about what some of the strengths and weaknesses might be? Sorry, Andrea, you didn't notice it there. Sorry.
I was just going to say it's an interesting debate in our sector because, as you said, Ian, many organisations claim to be matrix or non-hierarchical that are, and there's an implied criticism within that hierarchy is bad, whereas actually it's an established model that works well if you do it transparently and employ matrix methodology when appropriate. And that's where I'd position us. I agree with Annie. I don't think it's a bad thing. Quite open about that. And actually cooperatives that claim to be matrix are often very hierarchical, ironically, but there are some good cooperative examples too, which are more matrix, definitely weighted to more matrix. So I guess I wanted to flag the point that it's not a pejorative model. It's not a pejorative term. It's just a description.
Absolutely right. Yeah, and I think you're right, and it's good to point that out because as we kind of go on to the next slide and think about now, there are in fact strengths and weaknesses to all three of those as well. So there's wins and there are negatives with all three. And the key bit, again, like a lot of this, I hope this is kind of what a message I'm hoping to get across to you this morning, is it's about being aware of them. So what you can do is hopefully by being aware of the situation and the type of organisation you can, and what the strengths and weaknesses of each organisation are, you can then think about that when it comes to your in project management approach and make sure that you try to maximize the strengths, obviously, and minimize the impact of the weaknesses, because there's there's pluses and minuses with those three. So it's good to point out, Andrew, it's not pejorative at all, because there are reasons why doing a functional, that's why a lot of organizations do it. It works quite well for lots of things. Can anyone think what some of the benefits of, say, a functional approach might be, what some of the strengths might be to that, where you kind of organize things basically along the lines of the functions that are being done in the organization and bring teams together to do that? And Annie, yeah, what do you think could be a strength of that?
I think the strength of that is that when you are sort of categorized almost, then you know what your roles and responsibilities are, and which enables you just to get on and do the job, whereas sort of wondering where you fit in.
No, I think that's a really valid point, Annie. Thank you. Absolutely. You know what the role is. The role that you've got is related to your function. Your function's in the structure, in a place where you know what that is for and what you're meant to be doing, so you can crack on and do that. And from an extension from that, imagine if you're doing that for a period of time and you've got a function that you're particularly interested in. What's the strength of that, do you think, for that function and doing that piece of work? What happens as a result of having clear-minded people that know what they're doing, focusing on the tasks? What's the win from that, do you think?
You can get loyalty because people know what they're doing and they like what they're doing, they get on with what they're doing. But then you also get that knowledge and experience that's built up throughout that person's sort of time there.
Absolutely. I think both of those points are absolutely right. Rachel, sorry, you want to add something?
Hi, yeah, similar to what's just been said, really. I think when you're functional, you get to know each other's strengths and weaknesses, and that is a strength, and you work really well as a team. you get to know each other a lot better, and you know who to call upon if you're struggling with something. You know who's the expert within the organisation, because we all work together and know those things. Whereas Matrix, I've worked for an event company before where it's very similar to the TV example. All the people come together on the day, don't know them, never met them before, and that can be quite difficult to work in because you don't know those things. You don't know the strengths and weaknesses of those people if you're only meeting them like just for that.
Excellent examples. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Annie. And you're absolutely right. I think the word expertise is one of the key strengths of the functional approach, and it's one of its key, you know, I wouldn't want to have anything to do with, and people never let me, the finance function of Inspire, and they keep me very hermetically sealed away from it for very obvious reasons. And but the fact is that people that are dealing with the finance of an organisation and understand it and are dealing with it, you know, day in, day out, and understand what they need to do that, means that they do it really effectively and efficiently and well. And say a completely different, but not, you know, say a marketing function, if you've got a small marketing team of colleagues that are working together to achieve the marketing for the organization, and they understand what they're doing, then that expertise, that ability to actually deliver it really highly and well is a real strength. Quickly, can we think of what's maybe some of the weaknesses of the functional organization? Sorry, my screen keeps disappearing for reasons that just designed to kind of keep my heart going. Sorry, and any weaknesses to that we can think of? Annie, sorry.
Sorry, I suppose a weakness could be if you've had the same people in the same roles for an awful long time, then you lose that fresh outlook maybe a little bit, or people can get stuck in their ways. So I think you have to continue to implement change and training and, you know, resources to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and absolutely, I think, you know, it can lead to people becoming almost like a bit kind of change averse and a bit kind of very set in their ways, and that can be a disadvantage for organizations, especially as we're being impacted often by rapidly changing circumstances that are beyond our control, but we need to manage them. So absolutely, I think you're right, Annie. That is a weakness. Steve, can you think of another weakness of the functional approach?
I mean, you've just sort of covered it, Ian, but I was just thinking of a more recent example in my career where that's happened, and well, it's Einstein's definition of madness, isn't it? If you keep doing the same things over and over again, and you keep getting the same results. Maybe the point I'm trying to make is I think if you work in function all the time, you have to have elements of change embedded in that in order for your organization to be flexible. And I think our sector particularly gets quite stuck in function and doing the same things over and over again, and not getting maybe the results that we could do. So change management is particularly important. If we're going to embed it into project management, you know, we have to think about adaptability and flexibility within function, which I know sounds a little bit controversial, but it definitely needs to be part of it.
No, I think you're right, Steve. I think that's good observation, and I think you're right. I think we've got to try, you know, the pace of change out there isn't going to get slower, is it? It's going to increase, I think, incrementally, and it's one of the kind of almost like one of the givens in a world where there are very few, is that there's just going to be more change. So having a kind of a more functional approach where there's the dangers that Annie and you've alluded to, and then expected to do the same things and get different outcomes, is not a good approach. So we need to be more agile, using that word again, and able to adapt to change, and that's something which sometimes the functional structure can struggle with. Andrea, sorry, you wanted to add something?
I was just going to add another risk to the model, and that's around continuity. So not just the silo and stagnation and resistant to change, but over-dependence and risk attached to continuity or lack of continuity. So that's another reason, not just practical reasons, around bringing in matrix ways of working, like some of the work that we're certainly seeking to do at BCVS, and hopefully colleagues will start to recognise the methodology behind the madness as we unpick this. So cross-district working, for example, or, you know, bringing projects together. So there's methodology behind the madness with some of the work we're doing that might seem a bit flabby sometimes.
No, absolutely, Andrew. And I think
Annie's asked for a wee break, so yeah.
no,
I'd agree
absolutely.
with that, Annie.
I saw that.
Comfort
I think it's
break.
a comfort break. Absolutely.
Coffee break.
I'm
Sorry,
very-
I've had 2 cups of tea this morning.
No, but should we come back at about should we say 1/4 past? Is that okay? So kind of a quick loo and tea break is a good idea, I think, and then we'll go through the final canter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I don't know if everyone's back now, but I think people are making their way back, aren't they? That was a good break, an opportune time to break. I'm conscious that I've got quite a lot to canter through, so I may have to kind of pick up my skirt, so to speak, and sprint a little before in this final 45-minute furlong before we kind of come to a conclusion, if that's okay, because I've got quite a bit of ground I need to cover if I can. But I think it's been really good actually, and thank you for being so participative, because I think that's really helpful, and I hope it will make it enjoyable as well, that you're taking part so much and coming up with some of the answers of some of the questions, because it's good, because it demonstrates that you're thinking, which is always a good thing, and engaging with the material, which is good, because hopefully that will help it to kind of go in as well. I think if you're kind of actively involved rather than listening to me droning on ad nauseum, so that's good.
Sorry, can I just ask, will we get a copy of these slides?
Absolutely, and as I say, I'll send a glossary and a kind of a bit of a bibliography afterwards as well. I'll pull something together. It will be a bit quick and dirty, but absolutely, Annie, yes, and I'll send the slides through. We're doing it in a kind of a slide deck, so Michael, Nikki, and I are sharing the same SharePoint, so that we can see what everyone's doing, so to speak. But I can ping it through to Andrea, and yeah, we can share that with you, no problem at all. Okay, I think are we all ready to rock and roll for the final furlong? Excellent. I say so. I won't go back through all of the strengths and weaknesses, because I think we focused on the functional type of organisation, and we did that, which is good, because I think most of us work in functional organisations, and I think they are what you will find most of, not exclusively, but most of across both the public and I think the third sector as well, and actually a lot in the private sector too. So oh, sorry, Jade saying cameras out of action. So just a summary here of some of the strengths, and it's going back to what Andrea said earlier about the fact that it's there's not a pejorative nature to any of these organizational structures, so they've all got their strengths and weaknesses. So some of the strengths we've talked about: you get people with technical skills in the functional departments who really know what they're doing, and they become really good at what they're doing, and they develop expertise in that, and that actually means that they can really deliver a high quality in terms of efficiency, effectiveness, and so on. And I think the weakness, I've called it silo working, to try and kind of just very quickly summarize what we talked about. But in fact, what you said prior to the break was deeper than silo working. But I think it's that weakness of, yes, you can have, as Andrea said, you can have one person who becomes a bit of a node, and if they leave for whatever reason, you sometimes find the organizational knowledge walks out the door with them, and that can be a real problem with functional structures. You can also have as colleagues were saying, around the kind of whether it's robust enough to actually change, or whether people get a bit set in their ways and are a little bit resistant to change. So and also that it's less easy to have kind of a pan-organizational working, which I know Andrea just before the break was talking about why she's tried to bring in some initiatives and things to kind of almost force a little bit more of that pan-organizational approach and working, which I know she was saying can feel a little bit artificial at first, but actually is really useful, because it's only through doing that you can help to mitigate one of the big weaknesses of having a too functional approach, which is that you can then find that people are, they almost don't work for the organization anymore, they work for their team and their function, and they don't see how what they do contributes to the wider organization, and that failure of seeing that can mean that the organization becomes less robust and less able to deal with change, and less able to deliver things like projects effectively as well. So Matrix is where we have an organization where you've got kind of different people in different parts of the organization linking together. Often they come together for project delivery. One of the strengths is that a project can then become visible across the whole organization, because it touches more than one part. Whereas if you have a project within a more strictly functional organization, the project may live and die and begin, middle and end within one function area. Andrea knows Inspire well. She knows that I'm the director for learning, and she'll know that there's quite a few projects that I'm sure Peter and the central part of Inspire may never even, you know, get to know about much at all. And you know, that's not really a strength, because in fact I'm sure that if we could more effectively bring in other colleagues from the cultural and the library part of Inspire to help with project delivery, it would be better. It would deliver them better. So I am guilty of living within functional silos myself. But a weakness of a matrix approach is that it relies upon project management. I've said I come back to this, and this is the point where we come back to that point I talked about with project managers, is dual reporting, because often as a project manager and in a matrix organization, and projects often by definition have a kind of a matrix approach, so that you the project manager may have to project manage people for the duration of the project who you don't actually have line management responsibility for. And that means that the person you're managing for the purposes of the project effectively kind of has two bosses. They have their day-to-day business as usual functional line manager boss, and then they have, for the purposes of the delivery of the project manager as a kind of a boss. And that can lead to difficulties and problems in terms of, you know, just needing people and making it work effectively, because having two bosses is not easy, is it? It's more complicated to do than having one. Sometimes it's hard enough having the one. So that's one of the weaknesses there. The project approach, the kind of that film crew approach, the strength is that you have a really clear focus on the objectives of the project, and that's what the entire purpose of that team and organisation is for. It's there to make Poldark. It's not there to do anything else. But the weakness is when the project comes to an end and Poldark's in the can, there's absolutely no need to keep that team together, and they often don't stay together, and the organisation will probably cease to exist, and it will stop being that production team, and the individual members of that team will disperse and go and get other gigs with other production companies probably. So the kind of that, as colleagues I think talked to before the break, they won't necessarily be able to build that feeling of kind of trust and team working, which I think, Rachel, you alluded to this, is one of the things that you found. I think it was an event company that you worked for where that was tricky to do.
Yeah, it was an event company, live music concerts. So Tom Jones was one of the gigs, for example. So you've got Tom Jones has got his own team, he's got his own PR managers, and he's got his own people. And then we did all the production side of things. So we had a couple of people from our own team, but because we went all over the country, we often would get freelance sound technicians and engineers and things like that from that area. Same with the catering, we'd get bar staff from a catering agency that ran the bars, all completely different people from different places, and they didn't know each other either. And it was, you know, that can be challenging at times.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's just the logistics, and everyone doesn't know each other. That you can't get teams easily to gel, can you, if they're made up of complete disparate people? Kind of, yeah, it's very difficult to do. So that's a good example. Thank you. So moving on, so building on, once you understand the kind of nature of our organization, and I think we've identified that, why is it better to have a systematic approach to project management? And I think it's something that, you know, Andrea and I are hopefully, you know, really promoting today and over the kind of course of the 4 weeks of this, is that it is, but I'm trying to kind of get across why that might be the case. One of the things is it means that projects, if you have a systematic approach, will have a relevant business case or a project initiation document, call it what it will. There'll be a document that outlines why it is worthwhile doing the project and what the project is attempting to achieve. That's one of the things that will happen. If you take a systematic approach, it means that the projects will follow a recognized project life cycle. And again, we're going to come on to the project life cycle more in a bit. And also Michael will be talking about that, as will Nikki, when it comes to project planning and project implementation, because the project life cycle becomes absolutely crucial. But it's that understanding and taking a systematic approach to a project life cycle can basically head off a lot of difficulties and problems. It means that you have a structured methodology for how you're going to deliver the project, and that ensures consistency of practice as well. That's where your things like tools come in, like Gantt charts and other planning tools that help you to actually structure how you're going to deliver the project. It means you've got clearly defined processes and documentation, so that taking a systematic approach to project management and a shared approach across organisations, so that you understand, and across BCVS, so you understand what you mean by the various terms, can stop there being confusions and difficulties, which actually means things get done quicker and more effectively. It may take some time to set it up initially, but you'll save hours of time and hours of heartbreak by taking the time out at the start to ensure you've planned things and have got the paperwork in place and do it systematically. And I know there were colleagues on the who are in part of this whose job it is to do the kind of contracting and the paperwork and ensuring the documentation's in place for your organisation. And I know how that can sometimes take a little bit of a back seat and be seen as not being crucial. However, it's absolutely vital to the success, actually, of business as usual, but it's also vital to the success of projects as well. It can also mean more effective decision making at key stages throughout the life of a project if you understand and take a systematic approach. One of the key things there is about change within projects, and that's something that Michael will be focusing on very much in terms of the planning, but also Nikki will be focusing on very much in terms of the implementation. Projects do change from their original plan. They do. They almost inevitably will change, but it's how you manage the process of project change effectively to make sure the decisions that are taken are appropriate will make a key improvement to the likelihood of the project meeting its objectives and budget and delivering ultimately to people what it was supposed to deliver. It also means that you have clear reporting and escalation routes. We've already talked about how the project manager needs to be able to go to the project sponsor at key points if the project manager finds that they can't get the green light for something which they might need. But it's much easier if everyone understands what that responsibility is. And even, as Andrea said, if you are in fact having to do both the project sponsor and the project manager role, because in a smaller organisation that may be the case, then you at least know that you need to, wear a different hat to go and get the permission from the higher up part of the organisation, and that you're then acting in the role of project sponsor when you do that, not as project manager, and then go back to the project manager and kind of go, even though it's you, say, right, I've now got the green light, so I can now progress on that basis. And last but not least, it also helps to ensure that you have effective quality management throughout the course of the project, so that the quality of what you deliver for people is maintained and is as good as it can hopefully possibly be within the constraints of resources and so on. So that's why taking a more systematic approach is an effective one. So let's talk about this business case or the project initiation document, and what do we actually mean by this? So the business case is the actual thing, the document that's sometimes called the project initiation document, or PID for short, I think that's the Prince2 terminology, is a document that actually states what it is that the actual project is trying to achieve. It will, in broad terms, say who's actually going to be involved in this actual thing and who's actually going to be involved in delivering it. And there might be other people that are involved in the contribution to the business case, but the primary person who's got responsibility for pulling that together is the project sponsor. So it's the project sponsor's responsibility to pull together the case that will be the business case or the project initiation document, and ultimately get the approval so that the organisation has clearly said yes to the project. Because I've been involved in projects where I've kind of assumed that I've got the green light to go, but I haven't necessarily had that unequivocal green light. And if you don't have the unequivocal green light at the start of a project, believe me, then there are problems immediately, because you think that you've got the approval and in fact you haven't, and that can cause serious difficulties, career limiting serious difficulties. So better to make sure you've got the clear unequivocal approval for the project. And the typical business case content or project initiation document content is it's going to talk about the background to the situation and why the project is needed, what therefore the benefits of doing the project are going to be for the organisation and for the intended participants and end users. It's going to talk about how much money and resources are going to be needed to implement the project. It's going to identify, not in as detail as we'll come on to in the project management plan, but there will be some outline of some of the key risks. There should be an options appraisal, and I always do a very simple approach to options appraisal. I basically do three. I don't do the project. I do the project, but kind of at half the amount that it optimally would be, and then do the project at the optimal level. So they're the three options I normally will do when I'm doing kind of an options appraisal for a business case. And there might be some additional content as well that you put into the business case. It might be, depending on the type of project, you might need to outline some of the benefits in more detail that it's going to bring to particular participants. It might be that you need to talk about how this project will link with other similar projects that the organisation has, and that they might therefore have a relationship, not just as a project, but actually with other projects. Andrea, sorry.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. I was just going to flag with colleagues that they may not always see these, but a recent example for BCVS colleagues is the business case that went to our board regarding Know Your Neighbourhood funding. And I'm happy to share that as a learning tool in terms of, this is what it looks like in BCVS.
That's really helpful, Andrea. Thank you. It's good to have a practical example that makes it come to life for people, because so moving on from the kind of what's in the business case, what's the importance of the business case, and how does the business case relate to the kind of wider project cycle? Well, the thing about the importance of the business case throughout the project life cycle is that it's the thing that sets out what the concept behind the project is. It actually says this is, the why for the project. It also has the definition of what the project will do, and an outline of some of the key kind of deliverables of this project. What are the kind of benefits and the deliverables going to be? It will also talk about how resources should be deployed in order to achieve that. And it's also going to talk about the kind of change process and what change process will happen as a result of implementing the project. So what will the new business as usual be at the end of the project once the project's been implemented? Because it's those key elements that will give the people that have got the power to give the green light or not to the project the information about whether or not this project is worth doing. And it's important to make sure that we don't skimp on this stage of project initiation, because as Andrea will know, and I know, and I've already alluded to this, it's quite easy sometimes, especially in a world like the third sector that you're operating in, or learning sector. Well, I'm in the third sector as well, but the learning sector I'm in, there's a plethora of funding opportunities, and it can be tempting to go after all of them. But the reality of it is, if you do that, then what can really go horribly wrong is that you become a scattergun approach. You're doing too many different things. It's harder to actually focus and ensure that what you're doing is contributing to the overall benefit and strategy of the organization. And you actually end up potentially kind of shooting off in all different directions. One way to ensure that that is less likely to happen is by going through this process of doing a clear business case or project initiation document stage and getting that approval from your board and senior decision makers, so that at that point there's been a clear strategic analysis of what the contribution to the kind of overall objectives of the organization, the project, will make, so that you're not going to go off on something which ultimately, even if you successfully deliver it, doesn't actually benefit the organization particularly. And it is surprisingly easy to go off on a project tangent, do something, and even if the project is successful in its terms, i.e. successfully deliver it on time within budget, actually it didn't make a contribution that was that important to the wider organization or the key stakeholders that we're supposed to be supporting. So it's important that we make sure that the thing actually is worthwhile, basically. That's what this stage, that's why this stage is key. So I talked about project life cycles. We're going to talk about them a little bit more. What are some of the benefits of a project life cycle? Well, the benefits of having an understanding of the project life cycle, and this is something that Michael will be going into in much more detail when he picks up with you in a week's time, but it allows you to improve the planning of the work that you're going to do on the project. It helps you to clearly identify priorities for the project. As I say, it's a more effective risk management approach can be taken. You can actually estimate what the costs of the project are going to be, so the financial estimations can be more accurate. It allows you to actually ensure that the performance management is more effective, and you can actually ensure that KPIs and other indicators are being met. It allows you to look at a process of continually improving while you go through, and that kind of Kolb cycle of continual improvement can be built in to your project management, so you get into the discipline of reflecting, thinking about what could be better, evaluating, and then implementing improvements. That also means that when it comes to change management, which Michael will focus on very much, and Nikki will also, in terms of delivery of a project, how do you control changes, and how do you ensure therefore that changes don't derail a project or make the project do that horrible phrase mission creep, where it starts doing things that it wasn't originally intended to do, and the project has kind of expanded out of its boundaries, which can happen if it's not effectively managed. And it can mean that you have more effective stakeholder communication, which can not completely solve, but can help to mean that throughout the course of the project, all the key internal and external stakeholders are kept informed, so they're less likely 3/4 of the way through to say, why are you doing that? We didn't want that. Because that can happen, and we've all probably been there, and it isn't a great feeling, is it, when you've been beating your head against the wall to deliver something for about 6 months, and then somebody quite important external, I don't know, it's like, I don't know, for us it would be something like the kind of the local college or a community organisation, or says, why are you doing that in this housing estate, and why are you sure you're supposed to be delivering that kind of course in this way? And it's much better to not have those sorts of difficult conversations, and communication can help to ensure that they don't happen. So, benefits of conducting reviews throughout the course of the life cycle. Well, it means that you can constantly focus on what it is that you're supposed to be delivering in the project. It helps you to ensure that the business case is actually being delivered. It can improve the management processes. There are things which we call decision gates, which is just another way of saying effectively milestones in the project plan, because it's useful to have key points in the project in any life cycle where you will pause and think about where you've got to up to that point, and what you need to do between that point and to get to the end, and to then make sure that actually everything is going according to plan, and actually conducting a kind of a check to make sure that everything's going according to plan. And there are methods of doing that, like benefits reviews, to make sure that the intended benefits the project was intending to deliver are being delivered. Or you can do a more formal audit that might include, a financial audit. And it's quite useful because, again, what tends to happen in my experience, and I'm sure Andrea and other colleagues will concur, is that we tend to do that at the end or near the end of a project. What's much better and more beneficial to get into the habit of doing is creating these decision gates or milestones throughout the course of a project, so that periodically, obviously the frequency will depend on the size and the length of the duration of the project, but at periodic intervals, you actually undertake a benefits review and an audit. You stop and helicopter above and say, how is this going? How is this working? And you can actually have other reviews, including stage reviews again, which would be a portion where you actually stop all delivery on the core part of the project and actually spend a period of time reviewing. So it's like a mini evaluation throughout the course of the project. And again, it's really helpful to stop lots of the dangers that can happen with projects. Like I mentioned, that project creep, where the project has a tendency to start moving into areas it was never really intended to touch. And then the other thing, and again, colleagues have mentioned this morning, is the importance of doing a post-project review. Because I think colleagues mentioned when you were talking about some of the good, bad and ugly, some of the ugly was that there were projects that had happened where you hadn't had the time, for all kinds of reasons, to properly evaluate what happened in the project. And I would argue, and again, this is something that I try to do, and I don't always manage to achieve it, I'll be honest, but I do, and I'm desperately trying in my own practice and with my colleagues to do this better, is we must conduct the post-project reviews and do that really thoroughly and well, so that the lessons learned can be properly logged and that we can actually understand what we did wrong, what we did right, and so we can replicate the going right and we can mitigate the going wrong for the next time. And I don't think, if you take nothing away from this morning, but you take that, that would be a really powerful thing to take, because it can seem like a waste of time because the project's finished and you can, the whole, I mean, the human emotion when a project finishes is to kind of go phew, and to kind of just have that cathartic moment when you go, I've achieved it, it's there, and that's normal, and that's fine. And in fact, I would argue it's important to go and celebrate and do something and actually have something that marks the end of a project, especially if it's a successful project, which, hopefully lots of them are. Go, and even if it's not, but go and have a cathartic kind of end of project celebration, because I think that's important. But then you must do the project post-project review, and you need to involve your project sponsor in that review, and you need to involve your senior management team in that review, and you need your project managers, and you want to hear the voice of your end users as well, so to make sure that you're clear that the benefits have been realized of the project. And that's, I think, yeah, if you take nothing else from today, if you take that, that will be very helpful, because that's something I've kind of, I'll be honest, I've not always practiced it as I should, but in fact, it's a mistake I've made, and I'm hoping to learn from that mistake, because you get much better at projects if you do the post-project review. And also, a mistake I've made with projects is not doing the milestone or stage reviews sufficiently throughout the course of projects. And again, that's been why some of my projects have been subject to project creep and have not always been as effective as they otherwise would have been. So, learning summary. Why are projects structured as phases in a linear life cycle? Can we think why do we structure phases in a linear life cycle? Why do we put projects into a kind of a life cycle like that, with a kind of a beginning, a middle and an end? Can we think what some of the benefits of taking that approach are? Why do we think, what are some of the benefits of that life cycle approach? Sorry, the question's not very clear, is it? I've just noticed, I've noted it, so I'm kind of, but I think what it's trying to say is, what are the benefits of taking a project life cycle approach to the implementation of projects? I think that's what it's really asking. I think that's a clearer way. So can anyone, given what we've just covered, think what some of those benefits might be to taking this systematic life cycle approach to the implementation of projects and the project initiation? Kirsty.
You could review each phase as you go through it before you go on to the next phase. And I think it's good to kind of take stock of where you are and focus on that bit before you then move on to the next bit, if you can.
Brilliant, absolutely. So in a way, you're almost making the project into a series of mini projects with a start, middle and end. If you think of it in that way, absolutely, I think that's great. Thank you. Jade, sorry.
I'd just echo really what was just said, in that it kind of provides structure for your project delivery, and it allows everyone to kind of contribute to deliverables and look at the outcome, and it gives a clear direction, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Because if things pop up in your reviews that aren't working, it's kind of, you can take it back to the drawing board before it kind of goes really off scale. Does that make sense? And then
absolutely
kind of deliver that back and say what's going well, what's not. And if it does need change, you can use your structure to bring that about. So say financially, you said you deliver this at this cost, but then you realise 6 months through that's not working, we need additional. With that kind of cycle and moderating it throughout, you can go back, can't you, and actually present your findings and say why.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's really good. Thanks, Jay. That's I agree, absolutely. Stephanie?
There's a clear understanding of time frame, so when that project would like to come to fruition or when that expectation is, and you can work backwards from that as well. So you were all of the same understanding of when things will be implemented, when certain things will happen at different stages of the project as well.
Absolutely, that's great, thank you. And Steve?
It's an opportunity to develop tools for the organisation of good practice, but also things not to do. So anything that's been good practice can be adopted in wider parts of the organisation. It's always good to check and check again a good practice and bad things that are happening within projects, so you can develop as an organisation. And yeah, that's my point.
That's a good one. Thanks, Steve. I like that. Yeah, so it's good practice, and also things to avoid repeating because they didn't work so well. Andrea?
I think some of the additional benefits are really valuable too, not only in successful delivery, management and delivery of the actual project, but if you're documenting and feeding in stage reviews and lessons learned into new project development, you're building on that previous experience and learning rather than starting from scratch every time. Again, is a flaw doing this way. The other thing is almost the converse of well, I remember being really surprised at how useful this was, that if you plan a project properly in this life cycle, one of the key principles is you don't do anything too soon. So you plan what you're going to do in this stage. You don't start doing, because you've got a bit of time, something that's needed in Q3, because actually by the time you get to Q3, that might not be needed anymore if you're doing the reflective adaptation of projects. And that saves a lot of time, actually. It sounds like a counterintuitive sometimes, but to do it only what you need to do now, ready for the next stage, which may change, is else. And then the other thing I wanted to flag with just for BCVS colleagues really is this highlights for me the importance of project management rather than contract management, because contract management will serve the requirements of the contract, which may say you just got to report at the end of the contract. We'll leave you to get on with it. We don't care as long as you deliver. But that doesn't help us in terms of having those views regularly to identify any issues or risks, take corrective action. So we will be using a project management cycle going forward in addition to contract management requirements, and that is a change really. So, and hopefully colleagues we've all got different experience of this, but getting on the same page about understanding the benefits of the model.
No, I think that's a really good distinction between contract management and project management, because you're absolutely right, Andrea. The contract manager often will only stipulate, for example, the need for some kind of end evaluation, if at all, and sometimes they don't even stipulate that. So if you follow contract requirements, then that isn't often sufficient to project manage the delivery of the contract effectively, and you need to actually have the discipline to do additional activities that aren't mentioned in the contract, aren't stipulated, but actually you need to do them to effectively project manage the delivery of the contract. And it will mean the contract delivery and the project management delivery will be more effective as a result, and it will be smoother, more efficient. You won't waste resources, and as you say, one of the key resources for smaller organizations and all of us is time, isn't it, and our own time. So it saves us time, which is a huge win. So no, I think I agree absolutely. Rachel, sorry, you've got your hand up as well.
Just another one on the benefits of doing reviews, which I don't think has been mentioned yet, is because a lot of the comments so far have been on how it can improve if things are going wrong, and it's good for tracking learning from mistakes. But I also think that reviews are really good for when it is going really well, because if you're telling your team that, oh, you've done an amazing job, it's going amazing, let's keep going, building that momentum up is a really good drive for the team. Everybody works well with motivation and praise. So I think it's really good when it's just as good for when it's going well as for when it's not going so well.
That's a really good point, Rachel, actually, because one of the things, and I'm sure we've all had examples of this, One of the reasons why I like projects, and I have been involved in my entire working life in projects, is for that reason, Rachel. When projects go well and you have a good project delivery team and you're part of that project delivery team and things are going well and you're delivering the project and it's hitting its targets and it's doing really good work as well that you can really see the impact of, there's nothing better in terms of professional payback. It's actually, that's why you go to work. That's what, you really know, then you feel it in your actual essence that you're making a positive contribution and that what you're doing matters and it's really having an impact. And also working in a really close delivery team, just that camaraderie that comes from going through project delivery and the bonds actually that are forged with colleagues are really, really important, and it makes working, it takes it into a whole dimension where it actually becomes really, worthwhile, pleasurable and positive. And that's why, if I'm really honest, that's the selfish reason that I'm really into projects. It's because they actually provide me with a huge amount of kind of professional well-being, and I'll be honest about it, and that's why. And it even transcends, no, it doesn't, but it kind of even transcends the money, although it's really the money. Okay, but thanks, Rachel. That's true. It is good to remember how, and as a change process, project management can be revolutionary in terms of those, especially in a functional organisation, because those bonds formed in the more matrix way can really pay dividends, because afterwards, when it's business as usual, you'll always have a different relationship with those colleagues that you've successfully delivered the project with. And if there are other issues that crop up and you wouldn't normally speak to someone in, I don't know, finance or in another part of the organization because you wouldn't normally speak to them, you suddenly can. And yeah, sorry, Steve, did you want to come in? No, okay. So thank you. And then the next thing we're going to move on to, and this is going to be probably the final thing before we wrap up on the kind of project initiation, and then I'll set the scene for Michael for next week, because he's going to come in same time, same channel next week, and he will pick up where I've left off and do it much better than I do, because he's a much better delivery person than I am. Is a kind of a conclusion. So I'm going to talk about stakeholder engagement just before we wrap up. I've mentioned this at the start, didn't I, about how it's important to maximize your communications with stakeholders and try to ensure that the way you engage with stakeholders is positive, because it can have a really big impact on the success of the project. And it's something which, again, you need to kind of be mindful of at this early stage of the project. You need to have identified your stakeholders and thought about how you're going to communicate with them at the start. It's not the kind of thing one wants to be doing midway through a project. It's right at the very beginning. And again, it's another example, as Andrea said, where, again, the contract managers, if you've delivering a funding or contract, they often won't talk about this, but you need to do it. It's an important part of effectively delivering, I think, any project or contract. So what does stakeholder engagement mean? What are you trying to do? You're trying to understand what the various stakeholders' role is and what do they do. You're trying to think about what the stakeholders' business and their kind of what they do, and collectively and individually, how does that relate to the project? What is it that makes them have an interest and be a stakeholder in the project? Why would they be a stakeholder? What is it about the project that impacts either them individually or their organizations? That will also help you to understand how they approach the project and what their behaviour and motivation towards the project is. And we've had a number of examples when we talked about some of the good and the bad and the ugly, about how it can be tricky and sometimes external partners. And there was that example, I think it was Steve was talking about, no, it wasn't Steve, I can't remember who was talking about the difference between the, might have been Jade actually, talking about the difference between the some practitioners, and then there was a different group of kind of more kind of community focused, and there was some kind of more clinicians. I can't remember. Somebody talked about there was a cultural difference between key stakeholder groups, and it's understanding those motivations that can then help you to not completely eradicate, but smooth some of those tensions if you understand what motivates your different stakeholders. it allows you then to more robustly assess how they're going to react to various different types of approach and communication. It could be that for some stakeholders, the way to do it is through a Teams call like this. For other stakeholders, it would be absolutely imperative to do it face to face. And for others, it can be fine to send the lengthy, convoluted emails that I'm known and hated for, or it could be appropriate to actually do something much more pithy and concise and probably not get me anywhere near it. So you need to understand what it is you're trying to do and how you're going to communicate effectively with the particular stakeholder groups. And then you want to also understand the stakeholders' kind of environment, and you want to come up with different approaches that are going to actually help to build a good long-standing relationship with those stakeholders. Because, you know, are they fellow small community organizations? They might have real funding pressures, they might have other demands on their time, they might have other things which might seem as if they're disinterested in the project, but it's actually because they've got a whole other series of issues that they're having to deal with, and you need to be able to understand where they're coming from so that you can continue to get their buy-in to the project, but do it from understanding where they're kind of coming from, and then building from that. It's responding to their motivation to the project and why is it that they're interested, and trying to make sure that they get something from it. Because my approach to partnership is that people often talk about partnership and approach, but in order for it to really work, and this is true with kind of stakeholders, it doesn't have to necessarily be money, but there has to be some benefit that they actually are taking from the involvement. If the partnership and the relationship doesn't lead to both sides of the partnership having something that's tangible that they benefit from, then that's not going to work. It's not going to be that successful. And sometimes I think, especially in the third sector, we kind of shy away from that. Sometimes we think there's somehow something a little bit wrong with that approach, as if people benefiting from a project in some way might in some respects be somehow unethical. But in reality, you need for every participant and stakeholder to benefit. It doesn't have to be financial, it could be any kind of benefit, but there has to be something that makes it worthwhile, worth their while. And if you don't have that, and it's not understood and communicated effectively, then effectively what you'll get is kind of lip service from that stakeholder, and they won't actually properly engage. And when the chips are down and you need them to maybe do something or step up to the plate, you'll look around and find that they aren't there. And then finally, you need to determine the key areas that have the most impact on the success of your project, and how can they help actually make sure that the kind of project throughout its life cycle is being positively communicated. Because stakeholders are also your key ambassadors for your project. They go out there in the community and talk about the project with other people that you don't even meet, and that is that understanding of the fact that they are key ambassadors for the success of your project is really important. And you want them, don't you, to say the really positive things about the project, because that helps to create an atmosphere in which the project can really succeed. Whereas if the opposite happens, and it can, unfortunately, if the stakeholder engagement isn't managed effectively, then it can be quite difficult for a project to recover once it gets kind of branded as quote unquote failing in some way. It's very difficult to shake that, even if sometimes the basis on which that decision about it failing has been taken is not particularly, how can I put it, it's not based on fact sometimes, but it doesn't matter. Impressions in this case are very important. So you need to kind of manage that, and managing stakeholders for that is important. So my penultimate slide, the importance of managing stakeholders' expectations to the success of the project. So it enables more effective risk assessment, because you've understood what some of the key risks are and what the role of the stakeholders will be in helping to mitigate those risks. Michael will talk a little bit more about risk mitigation and risk planning as part of the wider project planning, because risk planning and understanding the difference between what is a risk and what is an issue, because again, I think that's something which people often don't understand. And I won't steal his thunder by giving you a definition now, but you know, it is a key thing to understand the difference between those two. It will help with improved communications planning, because understanding what the stakeholders are going to get, as I say, they can also act as key advocates and can really help to make the project a success if you manage that communication process. Again, part of project planning, every project needs a separate integrated communications plan as part of it to be effective. That's again something which sometimes projects don't always do as effectively as they might, and if you don't do it, it will always bite you. It's something that you should do, and it's an important part of any project. It can help to ensure that you actually have a productive team, because it can actually ensure that everybody is on the same page, and it can ensure that colleagues feel supported by the wider stakeholder community, and the fact that they're on board and supportive of the project can help to instill that very atmosphere I talked about when the team clicks. And it can enable effective engagement actions to be initiated. So effectively, if you need to start some part of the project, then having good stakeholder involvement can help that to be smoother. And it can actually increase the likelihood of the project getting approval at this outset if the stakeholders have actually been consulted and they come in as part of that project initiation business case. If there's some element of that that talks about the stakeholder approval, saying, yes, this is something we would advocate and want to see, then again, and especially if doing that options appraisal like approach I do, where you do no, don't do it kind of 50% or go 100%. If you can say the stakeholders want the 100% and you can demonstrate there's a need, then it's more likely to get that green light. So I'm going to skip through the quiz because I have run out of time, but I did have a short quiz at the end, but I can share that with you, and you can be, and I'll share the answers as well, so that colleagues, you can have a chance to have a quick recap and test how well you did. I'll also be sending out a kind of a how was it for you sheet as well, so you can kind of warts and all talk about my appalling delivery of this thing. And final conclusion, because we're now just 1 minute over, so I'm going to quit. We have covered the following things. We've talked about what the difference between a project and business as usual is, and I think we've had a quick idea of a definition of what a project is. We've talked about the fact that there are different project management approaches, all of which have their strengths and weaknesses, and which are appropriate to use elements of to deliver a project. But and in some instances, it may be appropriate to use the whole project approach. It might be appropriate to use a Prince2 approach for a project, for example. But it's for you to determine what is the most appropriate project management approach for the nature of the project. We've talked about the project roles, the sponsor, the project manager, and then the kind of business continuity manager, if you're lucky enough to have a business continuity manager. I understand that that can also be, you may be wearing all of those hats, but it's useful to understand that they are different hats with different functions. We talked about different types of organization, functional, hierarchical, or functional hierarchical is one, matrix and project, and we talked about what some of the strengths and weaknesses are in terms of project management of all of those, because they all have strengths and weaknesses. We analyze why it's good to be systematic when managing projects and what the benefits of taking that systematic approach are. We talked about the nature of a business case and what should be in that, otherwise sometimes known as a project initiation document. Doesn't matter, it's still the thing at the start that wins approval for the project. We talked about the project life cycle and the importance of taking staged reviews throughout that, not just at the end, but also doing it at the end, because believe me, I've done projects where I've not done it during the project or at the end, and then wondered why I've repeated my mistakes. We've talked about the importance of stakeholder engagement and how stakeholder active management of the stakeholder relationships can really help the project to be successful. We didn't have time for the quiz because I overran, apologies. But next steps, you're going to be talking with Michael next week. He's going to be, as I say, talking about the next step, which is the project planning stage in more detail. I think hopefully set that up for you. He will build on that, and I'm sure he will be very successful. Andrea, over to you, sorry.
Thank you, Ian. I just wanted to say thank you because I know how big and challenging this is, and I think running over by a few minutes, hopefully colleagues give us for that, because the interaction is really important. The point that I wanted to make is to repeat what Ian said earlier. This is a co-design process. We want to produce something that's useful to our sector, So please, when you're giving the feedback, bear that in mind. What will make this even more voluntary sector friendly, given the groups we work with. And also, just to flag what we all know, the voluntary sector does amazing things in spite of not having often project management systems. So this is about helping us and becoming a tool to enable us to be more efficient and more effective. It doesn't mean we're not doing great stuff, because we are. So I just wanted to state the obvious, but end on that.
That's a good thing to end on, Andrea, absolutely. And yes, and as a fellow third sector person, in fact, you know, as I've said, there are lots of examples where across Inspire we could improve our approach to project management and are on a never-ending journey, because it's like it's continuous improvement of quality. So we're on a never-ending journey just to improve and enhance our approach to project management. And there's no way in which we think we know everything that there is to know at all. We're finding our way through the dark, just doing the best we can in difficult circumstances along with everyone. So, and I know, you know, BCVS does fantastic work, and I know Stephanie's leading the Points of View project that we're a partner in, and it's all going very well. So, you know, you're right, Andrew. It's building on excellent strengths. I know that you're an organisation and colleagues from other organisations doing great work. So it's just to enhance that really by thinking some of these things which are quite practical, I hope, as well, and not. I hope it's not been. I hope it hasn't been too bamboozling with kind of jargon and stuff, and it's more things you can practically pick up and use. That's what I'm hopeful. So I will ping you the spreadsheet. It's not spreadsheet, no, it's not a PowerPoint presentation. I will send a glossary, and also I will try and put in some links in some kind of crude bibliography with things like, you know, Lean for Dummies and things that I've found useful. Thank you all. Thank you for your attention, and more importantly, thank you for your contributions as well, which I think were invaluable and helped make this really more successful than it would have otherwise have been. So thank you very much. And as I say, you will be seeing me week 4, so apologies for that, but you'll have Michael and Nikki to raise your bar. So, but you'll see me at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Ian.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Have a good
Bye.
rest of the day. Thank you.
You too. Bye.